The $500 billion bet. Why America's biggest dam is guaranteed to fail. Sirens cut through the dark. In the control room, gauges lurch upward, then freeze. A gate status light flips from green to unknown. This isn't a drill, someone says, but the radio is already spitting evacuation codes. Downstream, phones buzz, then die as the grid flickers. A thin sheet of water forms across the crest, quiet at first, before it hardens into a moving wall. To understand how a single night turns steel and concrete into rumor, we have to rewind. This is the West's biggest reservoir, the lifeline for millions. Decades of aging concrete, drought, then deluge, and one overlooked flaw have been waiting. The river we chained. Long before we gave it a number and a concrete address, the river taught seasons to the desert. Spring melt made it loud and brown. Summer heat made it slow and green. It flooded fields that weren't yet fields, filled side channels that weren't yet canals, and wrote its own boundaries without asking anyone's permission. Then we made a trade, floods for certainty, noise for a hum on the grid. A wall rose in a canyon, and behind it, a lake grew into a promise. Cheap electricity, steady water, flood control, growth could stack itself on that. Cities leaned in, farms planted on credit. Subdivisions sprouted far from natural creeks because they didn't need them anymore. Get this, nobody called it dependency, they called it progress. That first generation believed knobs and schedules could tame risk. Release rates replaced river moods. We'll store the chaos and meter out order, engineers said, and mostly, for a while, it worked. But control has a shadow. When you rely on a single valve to feed a valley, your day-to-day life becomes an engineering calculation. If the numbers are off, you feel it at your kitchen tap. Meanwhile, the river doesn't forget it's a river, it waits. Early warnings showed up like footnotes. Hydrologists pointed to outlier storms that didn't fit tidy charts. Geologists muttered about foundations and uplift pressures boring beneath safe-looking math. A maintenance crew logged hairline issues, alkali silica reaction here, a stubborn gate there, and requested next year funding that never made the final cut. The boom drowned the whispers. There were ribbon cuttings to attend, new pump stations to bless, power contracts to sign. A farmer downstream made the choice everyone eventually made. He swapped the flood he could see for a promise he could finance. He signed a delivery contract, tore out his old flood trenches, laid PVC, and put a timer on water the river used to decide. "Now I can sleep," he joked to his wife, "because someone else is staying up." He wasn't wrong. Somewhere, a night shift would carry his risk for him. Multiply that by millions. Las Vegas lawns, Phoenix data centers, Imperial Valley alfalfa, suburban dishwashers, and 1,000 invisible supply chains. 25 million people touch that lake every day without touching it. The trade bound their lives to a reservoir level and a set of gates. As long as the dial stayed in the green, nobody had to think about the canyon. But history collects interest. Every year of growth stacked more consequence on the same concrete. The original promise, store the surges, shave the peaks, never included a clause for a climate that swings wider. Droughts got longer. Storms hit harder and closer together. The math that once felt conservative started to feel nostalgic. Here's where it gets interesting. Safety on paper can hide fragility in practice. If your spillway handles the design flood, you're fine, unless a few minutes of cavitation peel it open. If your turbines can move water, you're fine, unless vibration forces you to throttle back at the worst moment. If your foundation is tight, you're fine, unless uplift finds a seam under an extreme head. None of those failure modes lives alone. That's the trap. We built a system where small misreads compound into big nights. The river we chained built empires of timing. Power auctions that assume a dependable spin. Crop cycles that assume a dependable allocation. Zoning maps that assume dry ground behind levees designed for floods we used to expect. The confidence paid dividends for decades. Tourists came to look over the edge and take selfies with the miracle of certainty. But the people downstream carry a different calendar. Ask the sheriff in a river town about false alarms and budget cuts. He'll tell you why the siren tests got cancelled and why, when the big text finally comes, half the county thinks it's spam. Ask the ICU nurse who tracks ventilator batteries during outages. The human layer is what the dashboard never shows. To understand the night those sirens actually mean it, we have to go back to the blueprints. Look at the assumptions baked into concrete, return periods calculated from a shorter, gentler past, spillways sized for storms that didn't train over the same watershed for days, foundations keyed into rock that looked unyielding on the survey but weeps under load. Look at the cost lines, the political deadlines, the phased fixes that move risk without removing it. Because the river we chained never agreed to our schedule, it accepted our wall until it didn't, and when it comes back to negotiate, it doesn't call ahead. The next chapters aren't about monsters or miracles. They're about what happens when a region outsources its margin for error to a single structure, and that structure meets a season that refuses to fit inside last century's numbers. The blueprint compromises. To understand the night the numbers go strange, we need to stand in the room where the numbers were born. Drafting tables, slide rules, ashtrays with long meetings ground into them. Hydrology baselines pulled from a record that felt long enough, because back then it was all anyone had. Storms were plotted as tidy bell curves. A probable maximum flood was calculated with margins that felt generous. The tails looked thin, because the past made them look that way. The concrete chosen was a kind engineers trusted, an arch-gravity hybrid that pushes into canyon walls while leaning on its own weight. Elegant, if the rock on both sides is as strong as the survey says, but rock isn't a uniform. It's a story of ancient water, pressure, and time. Lift joints, those horizontal seams between concrete pores, were keyed and grouted to behave like one monolith. On paper, the sheer keys lock. Underground, uplift pressures search for any place. A film of water can slip in and turn a seam into a lever. Spillways were the safety valves. Two side channels with drum gates, a chute intended to throw fury away from the wall and into the river. Design capacity, enormous, but capacity is a number tied to assumptions. Flow velocities above certain thresholds turn water into a grinder. Cavitation creates vacuum pockets that collapse like hammers, spalling concrete, biting at rebar, making a smooth chute rougher minute by minute. The fix is aeration and hard, polished surfaces. Those details cost money, time, and political patience. Seismic allowances went in too, not just for a single jolt, but for shaking that can loosen abutment interlocks and rattle gates. Back when the drawings were made, the regional fault maps were simpler. Peak ground accelerations were input as conservative estimates for that era. Since then, faults have been mapped tighter, and shaking models have grown teeth. The dam is strong, but strength has to meet the right kind of hit. Chemistry had a seat at the table, even if it didn't get a vote. Alkali-silica reaction, ASR, sounds like lab talk until it starts growing gel in micro cracks, expanding like slow moss inside the concrete, turning compression into microtension, swelling joints a millimeter at a time. Over decades, ASR can jam gates, distort alignments, and make routine maintenance feel like surgery. It doesn't mean collapse by itself. It means margins shrink without announcing themselves. Cost-cutting hid in plain sight. A governor wanted ribbon day before election season. A contractor proposed a substitution, a different aggregate, a phased spillway lining plan, a slightly thinner apron because the model said it would hold. Each move defensible. Together, they pushed the risk into corners nobody visits until the water does. Phased fixes turned into phased deferrals. We'll address aeration in Phase II. Phase II lives on a budget slide that never clears committee. What nobody talked about, dams rarely fail from a single insult. They fail when rarities stack. High inflows arrive after a drought-stiffened basin that sheds water faster. The operators hesitate because public optics hate wasting water. Gates cycle more than planned. A small chip in concrete becomes a notch that spawns a jet. The powerhouse trips offline, so the spillway takes more. That extra push drives uplift harder under a keyway. Each piece still within spec, but all of them together leaning toward a night like this. Meanwhile, the hydrology itself shifted. Atmospheric rivers got fatter, warmer, and stacked closer together. The old return period language, 100-year, 500-year, rests on stationarity, the idea that the past predicts the future. When the future's dice get loaded, those comfort words go brittle. Probable maximum flood guidance should have been updated more often. It was. Committees requested new studies. The studies waited on appropriations. Meanwhile, the river wrote its own update. Inside the powerhouse, penstocks, the big steel pipes were sized to feed turbines optimally, not to pass a flood. Turbines can move a lot of water, but only if vibration stays within limits. When drafts cavitate and bearings heat, operators throttle back to save the machine. That's smart for 1 hour, dangerous for the next 6. Bypass options exist, but they're finite and were never meant for compound extremes. Responsibility split like the river downstream. One agency owns the dam, another buys the power, local districts own levees, counties manage alerts. In meetings, that sounds like collaboration. At midnight, it's a patchwork of dashboards and protocols. A dam operator can open gates, a sheriff can order evacuations, a grid dispatcher begs for stability. Each actor manages their slice. The river manages all of it at once. The drawings anticipated wear and tear. They didn't anticipate politics. A drought narrative can make early drawdowns look reckless. Why release when we just spent 5 years praying for rain? So pre-releases wait until confidence is high, which means later, which means closer to the cliff. The best time to lower reservoir is before the storm forecast looks certain. The law often demands certainty before authority clicks in. Here's the uncomfortable truth the blueprint can't say out loud. Safety is dynamic. It lives in updated models, functioning sensors, real drills, and the humility to admit that designed margins have drifted. The math looked safe because the math was honest about the past. The climate, the chemistry, the politics, and the money rewrote the dice. And the dice don't care what the legend on the original plan set promised. Drought, then deluge. 3 summers in a row, the lake dropped like a clock losing minutes. Every week the bathtub ring climbed higher, chalk white against red rock, a scar you could measure from the highway. Intake towers rose out of the receding blue like abandoned elevators, their lower mouths flirting with air. Operators watched the levels slide past comfort marks and into territory the original manuals treated as theory. Heat waves stacked, not the dry heat people used to joke about. This was a heat that changed math. Evaporation turned acres into sky. The surface area shrank, but the rate didn't care. Each degree shaved days off storage. Maintenance windows that required low water should have been a gift. Instead, deferred work met deferred budgets. A crack logged at monitor stayed monitor. An inspection dive noted spalling near a gate recess. The follow-up was penciled for next fiscal year. Onshore, crews walked delta fans that weren't there a decade earlier. Silt settled where cool water used to plunge, changing currents, nudging pressure where designers didn't plan. Trash racks clogged more often with driftwood and plastic, telling a story nobody had time to read. The lake, once a buffer you could count on, felt thinner, less like a bank account, more like a line of credit with fees. Then the forecasts shifted tone. Early winter storms underperformed. Snowpack lagged, then suddenly didn't. A parade of atmospheric rivers started drawing lines across satellite images, warmer than the ones in old case studies. They climbed the coast, wrung themselves out over mountains, and kept arriving. Each one alone would have been a headline year. Together, they looked like a dare. Hydrologists called it hydrologic whiplash. A basin baked into concrete by drought doesn't sip, it sheds. So when the first big warm storm hit a modest snowpack, runoff ramped fast. Reservoirs upstream held low for years, filled quicker than rules of thumb expected. Operators had space, they used it. By Storm 2, the snowpack had doubled. By Storm 3, the snow had turned dense and primed. Rain fell on it, heavy, warm, relentless, and suddenly the snowpack wasn't storage. It was fuel. Here's the kink: empty space is only safety if you understand refill rate. The playbook treated storms as pulses with breath between them. Release a little, watch the gauges adjust. The reality was stacked systems, watersheds saturated, tributaries peaking simultaneously, and forecasts hedging just enough to make early aggressive releases look premature. Public pressure still hummed under everything. After so many dry years, nobody wanted to see water wasted to the sea. From the control room, the lake curve turned steeper than anyone liked. Incremental releases got bumped to strong releases. Calls went out to downstream districts, watch levels, deploy crews. Grid dispatchers asked for steady power through the storm, turbines obliged, until vibration alarms started to chatter. Running hard in cold, sediment-rich inflow is different than running hard in a calm summer. Bearings feel it. Draft tubes feel it. The operators felt it in their ribs. A technician took the night shift, lake reading by habit, even with digital sensors blinking it in neon. He chalked the staff gauge at 2 a.m. and again at 10 a.m. 6 feet apart on the same concrete. He logged it, stared at the pencil mark, and for a second didn't trust his own hand. The lake, which used to move inches a day, was now a living thing. Upstream reservoir managers called with their own bad news. They were full and sending. One had an unplanned gate maintenance issue that narrowed options. Another faced inflow from a burn scar, blackened slopes delivering ash and logs that would become somebody else's debris problem. The river system was behaving like a single body, every limb thrashing at once. Forecast models tried to keep up. Ensembles showed a spread of outcomes, most of them ugly. A late burst of cold could have paused things, bought days. It didn't. The next atmospheric river trended south but retained its punch. Snow lines rose. Snow turned to slush, then to runoff that bypassed soil. Staff hydrologists started talking in shorter sentences. The words "probable maximum" got thrown around in a tone that meant "we may find out." Operators leaned into the only levers they controlled: gates, turbines, spill priority. The playbook said gradual increase. Reality said stair-step now, not later. But every step up sent a different problem downstream. Levee districts with century flood designs were already near the top of their play. Bridges collected mats of trees and fencing. A hurried call asked the dam to pulse instead of roar to ease a vulnerable reach. The request made sense for them, not for the canyon. Meanwhile, maintenance ghosts came back. An aeration upgrade on the spillway had been scoped but not installed. At low to moderate flows, it didn't matter. At high velocities, the lack would matter. A hairline in a transition slab, marked and filed, sat right where water would try to bite. The staff knew every inch of that chute. They also knew they couldn't not use it. A drought teaches caution about letting water go. A deluge punishes hesitation. The lake shrugged off the last foot of comfortable. Radio chatter tightened. A senior engineer pushed for aggressive pre-release 2 days earlier. The memo got parked. Now, with the lake surging, the same move would look like panic on paper, but prudence in the canyon. The window for easy choices had closed, while everyone argued about optics. When water outruns policy, only steel and concrete decide. The shift from drought to deluge wasn't a plot twist. It was the system revealing its new baseline. The river was here to collect on the years we borrowed margin from the future, and it wasn't interested in our reasons. The 3 traps. Midnight writes with numbers, but the river reads the weak spots. 3 traps were set years ago, waiting for the right sequence. Trap 1 sits in plain sight, the spillway. It's the valve you trust until velocity turns water into a tool. At low flows, the chute hums. Push it hard and the flow sheets detach from the concrete, pockets of vapor form and collapse like fists. Cavitation. Each blow is invisible until it is. A smooth surface becomes pitted. Pits become teeth. Teeth catch eddies that pry at rebar. At design meetings, aeration slots were a line item. At this flow, they're a prayer. Operators hear the howl first, a rising metallic note. The river only sings when it's chewing. They add a notch to release more, trying to spread the energy. The notch answers with spray and chips peppering the night. The second trap hides in steel, the powerhouse bypass limit. Penstocks are the muscles of the dam, but they weren't built to sprint a marathon in a thunderstorm. Turbines can pass a lot of water, yet not at any cost. At high heads, draft tubes vibrate, bearings heat. Protective relays don't care about weather, they trip when they must. So when grid dispatch calls begging for steady megawatts, the operators nod, then wince as alarms stack. Throttle slightly, and you save the machine but push more burden to the spillway. Open fully, and you risk tearing a runner apart. It's a choice between expensive damage now or structural danger later. There's no setting labeled, satisfy both physics and politics. Trap 3 is older than the dam. Foundation uplift and seepage. Water under pressure is stubborn. It probes along lift joints, keyways, contact seams with the canyon. Drainage galleries and relief wells are there to bleed that pressure off. They work until head rises faster than they can whisper it away. Instruments start to twitch. Piezometers show small but unmistakable trends. Uplift forces tick higher. An abutment joint that always acted like rock begins to act like a question. Seepage monitors, usually boring, become the only numbers anyone respects. Layered on top is the human split screen. The dam operator answers to reservoir safety and downstream flow limits. The power marketer answers to contracts and a hungry grid. Levee districts answer to sand, riprap, and phone calls from neighborhoods that shouldn't see water. None of them is wrong. Together, they create a trap of divided attention on a night that demands a single mind. Here's where the traps talk to each other. The spillway takes more flow because turbines are rattling. The cavitation damage roughens the chute, which increases turbulence, which magnifies uplift at the toe, which telegraphs pressure back under the dam. The foundation instruments rise, so conservative instinct says ease back, except easing back would push the lake another inch toward the crest. In the control room, you can feel the margin thinning by the way people stop finishing their sentences. The supervisor calls for a gate sequence that's supposed to balance pressure across piers. The timing is tight, staggered openings seconds apart to avoid a hammer. The first gate's answer. One lags a beat, sticky from age or cold, or a bit of misalignment no one had time to fix at low water. That single hitch sends an uneven wave into the chute. Cameras catch a section where spray suddenly goes opaque. Concrete is turning to mist. The engineer watching knows that's not just water. Downstream, levee crews burn through their third pallet of sandbags in an hour. A bridge has started to catch debris, and the river is making its own shortcut into a neighborhood designed for quiet mornings. A county voice on the radio asks, "Can you hold for 2 hours?" There is no way to explain that 2 hours tonight is a different thing than 2 hours last spring. The emergency spillway enters the conversation. It's on the drawings, a broad crest meant for rare. Rare is relative now. It's never been pushed to full design. The hillside below it is armored on paper. In the real world, armor only works with flows that don't excavate at the edges. Testing it at midnight in a storm with helicopters grounded by wind feels like handing the river a new tool. Still, the calculation is brutal. Spread the load or watch the crest. Meanwhile, the powerhouse protection scheme did what it was built to do. It tripped. Black start options exist, but they aren't positioned for a storm like this. Spinning reserve that could absorb bumps isn't where the wire's needed. Grid frequency wobbles, tightens, wobbles again. Operators throttle a hair more to keep a runner from singing itself apart. That hair shows up at the crest. Every 30 seconds, a new detail edits the plan. A relief well reads high. A gate sticks then freeze with a bang that echoes in the galleries. A seep weep turns to a thread. Someone cracks a joke and nobody laughs. These are professionals, but they're inside a system designed to work only when no part asks for more than its share. The tease is simple and awful. We open everything we can and still lose ground. The lake rises a fraction faster than steel can lower it. The safe margins that look generous in daylight now sit on the wrong side of a decimal point. A number appears on the midnight log that nobody's written before. The traps didn't need to fail individually. They only needed to agree on a minute. Minute 0, warnings ignored. 3 days earlier, the radar started drawing the same bruised stripe over the watershed again and again. Training cells, storms that didn't pass through so much as set up camp. The models hedged, but the pattern was clear enough for anyone who'd stared at a river map longer than a budget hearing. Upstream reservoirs were already flirting with their top lines. Calls went out on quiet channels. We should start moving water. County Emergency Management asked for a pre-release. Politely at first, then with the edge that comes from remembering the last evacuation. The answer wasn't technical, it was political. Drought had rewritten public patience. After years of telling voters to save every drop, nobody wanted to sign the order that sent blue water through a canyon on a forecast. Optics, someone said in a meeting, which is another way of saying, we'll wait. Inside the dam office, an engineer wrote the memo anyway. Early drawdown recommendation, backed by ensembles and a conservative read of the snow line. The math was on his side, but the memo landed on a Friday. The weekend loomed, decision-makers dispersed, and the urgency of a graph couldn't beat the inertia of a calendar. It was parked, hold for Monday, as if storms respect weekdays. The siren test had been cut from the quarterly plan months before. Budget triage. The line item that funds a noise people complain about is easy to cross out when nothing is happening. So when the county pushed a reminder text, severe weather possible, be prepared, the replies came back with eye rolls and joke emojis. False alarms teach people to ignore real ones. You only get so many drills before the audience stops showing up. Minute 0 started long before the lake touched the crest. It started when the first request for pre-release ran into drought optics. It started when the engineer's memo met a stack of other memos about roads and schools. It started when the last siren test was cancelled because nobody wanted to explain a loud morning to a quiet neighborhood. All of those small decisions converted manageable flow into panic waiting to be born. Meanwhile, the upstream managers were dealing their own hand. A burn scar watershed sent pulses of black water and logs. Their gates were sticky from cold and silt. They called down with numbers that sounded reasonable until you added them to every other reasonable number. We're at 92% and rising. We're topping out our gate 1. We can hold a day. Each statement true. Together, they formed a sequence that should have triggered the bigger truth. The system was out of slack. In the control room, the senior operator pulled up the composite radar feed and saw the band fattening and pivoting, feeding the headwaters again. He keyed the mic to the county duty officer. We're making an incremental increase. The county asked for a schedule. He gave them one with hours and CFS. It looked neat on paper and meaningless in the sky. He hung up and said to no one, "We're late." Downstream, the sheriff's office started getting weather questions, not panic curiosity. Do I need sandbags? Will the park flood? Is the bridge closed? The 911 board that should have been reserved for fire and life filled with forecasts. A dispatcher tried to redirect callers to a website. The site crashed under traffic. They shifted to social media. A rumor about a dam breach trended for 10 minutes, then got buried under a photo of hail on a patio table. Micro-story. At 2:17 p.m., the sheriff stood in front of a whiteboard and drew a line down the river, town names marked in dry erase. He told his deputies to check the low mobiles home parks and the RV park by the bend. Phones kept ringing. One deputy joked that the river would call if it had a problem. Nobody laughed. The sheriff didn't look up when he said, "Order the buses anyway." A minute later, he crossed it out because the buses were already on a school run. The engineer who wrote the memo watched the lake climb in half-foot ticks and thought about the paragraph where he'd used the phrase, "high confidence." He considered sending a follow-up with bolder words, then didn't. He knew the optics. He also knew that a Saturday morning release would have looked wasteful on the evening news. His screen showed the snow line rising into the band of scarlet radar. He clicked refresh, even though the numbers update themselves. Public Works pre-staged barricades at the usual underpasses, treating the coming water like a winter nuisance. The wastewater plant supervisor texted his boss a photo of the influent channel already toddling toward the rim. He asked for permission to bring in extra pumps. The reply came with a question about overtime caps. Minutes matter, so do line items that were set in June. When the rain hit the snow line, it stopped being picturesque. It turned white into runoff and runoff into something with momentum. Upstream calls shifted tone. We're at spill. We're increasing to match inflow. No, we can't pulse. The county asked the dam for clarity. The dam asked the sky for mercy. The sky answered with another cell. The sheriff finally drafted the evacuation order. It took 10 minutes to route through legal and 2 to enter into the alert system. The alert system did what it was built to do. It tried. Cell networks, already sagging from weather and chatter, choked. Some phones screamed. Some buzzed without lighting up. Some stayed quiet on a charger in a kitchen that would, in a few hours, be part of the river's memory. The delay had done its work. What could have been a slow, visible lowering of the lake across a day became a last-hour scramble across jurisdictions. The difference between a planned inconvenience and a panic is a handful of choices made when the sky was still blue. Tonight, those choices were coming due, and the snow line, now a moving border, kept climbing into colder country, turning the map of safety upside down. The surge arrives. At 6:41 p.m., the first pair of spillway gates lift. The sound is a freight train note that doesn't come from rails, it comes from water finding speed. The plume clears the lip clean, sheets for a heartbeat, then turns savage. Operators lean toward the monitors, listening as much as watching. There's a pitch the chute makes when it's healthy. This isn't it. Cavitation announces itself as a howl threaded with a rasp, like metal singing through its teeth. Spray atomizes into a silver fog that eats light. 10 seconds later, the camera downchute catches a blur where the water should be glassy. The blur is concrete coming apart in grains. Nobody says cavitation. They don't need to. They notch the gates higher, trying to thin the sheet to keep the water attached. For a minute, it works. Then the tone climbs. Flow velocity clears the safe numbers and keeps climbing. Aeration that should have been there is a plan, not a slot. The sheet detaches. Vacuum pockets form and collapse, hammering. Chunks of chute, fist-sized, then brick-sized, vanish into white. A plume of brown appears where there shouldn't be any color at all. The river is chewing its way up the spillway, turning smooth into rough, rough into turbulence that multiplies force. Inside the powerhouse, the grid reads the storm as a hunger. Frequency dips, recovers, dips again. Dispatch calls with tight voices, hold steady, we're fragile out here. Turbines push to oblige, runners spinning clean, then not. Draft tubes start to shudder. Vibration alarms chatter like insects. Bearings pick up a few degrees, that's enough. Protective relays don't argue philosophies, they trip. One unit blinks out. The light in the control room changes when a generator goes dark. It's subtle, but everyone feels it. They bring another unit down by hand, slower than the machine wants, nursing it through resonance bands to keep it from singing itself apart. The penstocks feel like throats clearing under pressure. Every megawatt lost is cubic feet per second that must go somewhere else. There's only one somewhere else. The spillway gates lift again. The howl answers. Downstream, the river jumps its bank in places that never studied flood maps. Levee crews roll with pallets of sandbags that feel like teaspoons. A loader slams into berms that look tall at noon and look small now. Debris from the burn scar upstream arrives like a statement. Black timber, fencing, propane tanks, the kind of mix a flood remembers long after people forget. A bridge grabs it, then becomes part of the reroute. Water licks at a road that led to a subdivision named for birds that no longer nest there. A man in waders, standing in a favorite eddy with a nightfly rod, feels the river climb his boots. He checks his watch. He hasn't moved. The water has. It takes his knees and tells him something's wrong without a word. He stumbles to gravel that's no longer gravel, but a slope. Back in the canyon, the chute loses a slab the size of a pickup. You don't see the slab. You see the spray change from frayed to shredded. The impact basin, designed to break force, takes a blow off axis, starts to churn. Energy that should be spending itself forward bounces back toward the toe. Seepage instruments upstairs twitch. A gallery meter adds a tenth. Uplift reads through the rock like a rumor that refuses to stay quiet. They try to shape the flow with the gate sequence, staggered openings to avoid a single jet. The plan works on drawings. In weather, one gate hesitates again, just enough to make an asymmetry that the water exploits with glee. The sound changes to a fluted scream. In the gallery, a tech feels the floor hum in a way that isn't on any legend. He writes the number anyway. Power tries to come back. Black start is a phrase that promises heroics. Tonight it means diesel growl in the wrong county, geography owning time. Islands of the grid hold, flicker, hold. Hospitals in the valley switch to backup and discover that diesel doesn't refill itself when roads go under. A dispatcher says the quiet part's soft. We can't count on you. The operator stares at the turbines that are trying and at the sheet of water that doesn't care. Debris complicates the lower river. A levee that last saw attention during a ribbon cutting is getting tested by logs behaving like battering rams. Crews stack, curse, stack more. A supervisor eyes a seep on the landward side that wasn't there an hour ago. He puts a hand on the wet spot as if he could argue it back into the river. It doesn't listen. Shoot cameras fog, then die one by one. The feed that remains is a wide shot that shows spray where there should be air. Radios pick up a phrase nobody likes, loss of visual. From then on, they fly by instruments, piezometers, strain gauges, lake level. Numbers don't panic, but the timing between updates feels like a drumbeat. A valve in the drainage gallery is opened another half turn. The water that comes out is warmer than the rock, a bad sign. The relief wells bleed, but head is head. The reservoir level ticks upward with an indifference that feels like insult. The lake wants over. Steel and concrete argue for time. Then the powerhouse trips again, a cascade across remaining units. The control room goes quiet in a new way. You can hear the spillway through concrete, low thunder with a knife edge. They open the gates to their marks. There is no more open left to open. Down in the valley, a mother loads 2 kids into a sedan, while a siren that should have meant drill now means leave. She pulls onto a road that's already reflecting sky. Her phone vibrates with an alert that arrived late and still matters. She doesn't know about cavitation or uplift. She knows the river has a tone she hasn't heard before. Losing the spillway shifts everything onto the dam body. It wasn't built to be a river. Tonight, it's pretending to be one, and the pretense is wearing thin. The surge has arrived, and every choice ahead narrows to hard or harder. The decision that breaks the night. In the control room, the question narrows to two bad answers. Keep forcing the spillway and risk tearing it open to the roots, or protect the structure and let the lake climb toward the crest. Overtopping sits on the table like a word nobody wants to say. The lead operator looks at the lake curve, then at the vibration logs that argue for mercy the spillway can't afford. They try to thread the needle with a gate sequence. The stagger is supposed to spread pressure along the piers, seconds between lifts, like easing a door in a windstorm. The first pair rise clean. The third hesitates again, that half-beat stutter that turns hydraulics into percussion. A pressure wave slams the adjacent pier with a slap you can feel in your elbows. Downshoot, the spray changes shape as the flow snaps sideways and bites at concrete that wasn't meant to be a target. Someone says, "We need the emergency spillway." The room goes quiet for a breath. It's on the plans, the broad crest built for nights like this, but nobody has ever pushed it to the numbers printed in neat font. On the hillside below, armor sits where the report said to put it. The edges are the question. Water loves edges. The chief engineer shakes his head, then nods anyway. We prep the emergency, but we don't commit until we must. Helicopters might have scouted the hillside, dropped rock into trouble spots, watched for undermining. Winds pin them to the ground. Night adds its own veto. A pilot radios from a hangar across the valley, ceiling too low, gusts too wild, no-go. The option closes without drama, just weather. They make the call to the county, issue the evacuation order. The sheriff agrees and pushes the button. The cell networks, already limping, seize. Alerts trickle instead of flood. Siren towers that should have screamed stayed silent months ago, victims of a line item with better lobbyists. In kitchens and bedrooms, some people move. Others keep watching a show a little too loud to hear a phone buzz. Back at the dam, the lake rises another inch. Overtopping becomes a math problem with a clock. Parapets weren't built to meet water coming from behind. The upstream face is strong enough to bear a reservoir. The downstream face isn't made to be a waterfall. A minute on the wrong side of the crest can start a scar you can't paste back. They try one more gate shuffle. A newer operator reads numbers in a voice too fast. The supervisor slows him down. Breathe. Sequence A, then B, 3 count between. They lift. The lagging gate sticks longer, then freeze with a bang that rattles the gallery. That bang sends a hard pulse down the chute and a soft one back through the body. Instruments twitch. The spillway's howl climbs a step. The operator swallows. We are past stable. The emergency spillway decision comes back. A junior engineer, the kind who still brings binders to night shifts, opens to the page with design discharge curves. The chief does the mental subtraction, what the turbines can still pass without eating themselves, what the main spillway can take before it starts tearing at the toe, what remains that the emergency crest must carry. He doesn't like the number. He likes the alternative less. They draft the line, initiating emergency spillway in 15. The county asks what that means in plain language. He answers honestly, "We're going to put water where we haven't put it before." Downstream supervisors picture a hillside turning to slurry. They ask for a pulse, not a ramp. The river doesn't take requests, but the dam still has to pretend it can. Then the grid throws in a complication. An intertie trips in the next state, a weather knock-on. Frequency wobbles. Dispatch begs for stability. The operator wants to tell them that stability is a wish tonight. Instead, he nudges a turbine back into a band that keeps it alive for 20 more minutes. 20 minutes is everything and nothing. They take a last look at the crest. The lake is whispering at the lip, a cat's tongue of water testing concrete it's never touched. Overtopping would start as a sheen, then thicken into a sheet that tears at parapet and downstream face. The chief knows the studies. A moment of uncontrolled flow can excavate the downstream toe, send uplift through the galleries, and make a problem a catastrophe. He lifts the radio. Open emergency, 10%. Water goes where it wants, over concrete not meant to see it. The emergency crest takes the first spill like a surprise guest. For a handful of heartbeats, it looks manageable. Then the hillside shows its opinion. Armor holds in the center, but the margin, where design meets geology, starts to fray. Brown threads stitch into the white. A small gully appears where the model didn't bother to draw one. In the control room, two maps compete for attention, the lake line inching towards safety if they can hold the flows, and the aerial schematic of the emergency channel that's busy making its own corrections. A tech in the gallery calls in a seep that wasn't on any tour. Penny wide, coffee warm. Another says a drain ran cloudy for a second, then cleared. Data points that mean nothing alone, everything together. The impact lands in a sentence that nobody wants to own. The safe choice ensures overtopping in 40. They've split the flow to save the main chute, but the emergency's limits force a ceiling. The lake doesn't care about ceilings. It cares about volume and time. The team stares at the arithmetic they've created, trying to find minutes that don't exist. For a moment, silence fills the room. Outside, the dam roars on two fronts now, a duet of water arguing with geometry. The decision that breaks the night isn't a single switch. It's the sum of every earlier compromise arriving at once. They chose to protect concrete, and the lake chose to rise. 40 minutes is a lifetime and an instant. They spend the first 10 hoping for a miracle, and the next 30 managing the reality they made. Overtop. The first sheet creeps over like a breath held too long. It's thin, almost polite, a shimmer that licks the crest and hesitates, then it thickens. The lake stops asking permission and starts making decisions. Parapet blocks meet water coming from the wrong side and don't know what to do with it. Mortar that never expected to taste a reservoir goes soft. A chunk breaks free with a sound like a table leg snapping. The sheet becomes a fall. On the downstream face, concrete meant to face air now meets speed. The initial sheen tears into fingers, then a single roaring sheet. Water feels for edges and finds them, prying into micro steps, worrying seams that never mattered. The protective apron below, meant to catch spray and keep the toe honest, starts to feel the weight in places it was never meant to. Undercut begins as a suggestion, a darker line where light shouldn't be, and grows into a mouth. Rebar has a voice when it's dragged across stone. It screeches in a register that cuts through thunder. Inside the body, instruments answer the new regime. Seepage monitors climb from fussy to insistent. Uplift reads like a tide, slow but inarguable. The abutment joints, those stubborn lines that always behaved like good rock, work a fraction, then a hair more. Someone marks a gauge with a pencil, because pencils leave truth on paper that screens can hide. Camera feeds drop out with insults of static. The last clear view is a high shot that shows white where gray used to be and gray where white shouldn't. Then it dies too. After that, it's sound and numbers. The roar becomes continuous, a freight tone welded to a waterfall's body. In the gallery, the hum changes from background to presence. You can feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat. On the bridge downstream, a family idles in taillights that don't move. They watched the river earlier because it was a novelty. Now the fingers they laughed at splice into each other and aim for the deck. The dad inches forward, sees water climbing the abutment stones, and decides badly he tries to turn. The sedan slews. A truck behind them rests a hand on its horn, then gives up. The bridge was rated for traffic, not for water clawing at its toes. A trooper sprints into view, waving, not because he thinks he can stop the river, but because he can still move people who haven't realized they're part of it. Back at the dam, the crest starts to slough at the edges. Parapet fragments tumble and disappear in spray, then reappear below as projectiles battering the apron. The downstream face takes on a sheen that looks smooth until you see the ripples. Those ripples are footnotes in concrete. Water loves footnotes. It writes in them. The gallery radio calls stack. Drain 7 turbid. Relief line 3 at max. Abutment B joint at +0.1. The numbers aren't apocalyptic. They're persuasive. Individually, each one is within a life the dam has lived before. Together, they tell a story nobody can unhear. The chief engineer closes his eyes for a second and sees the cross-section drawing he's known for 20 years. He knows where the weak line would trace if it chooses to. On the valley floor, floodwater turns corners that maps don't show. It jumps a ditch, finds a bike path, becomes a flume, and points itself at a cul-de-sac that was sold for its quiet. At the wastewater plant, Influent tops the weirs. A supervisor keys a radio and says a sentence he's never said. "We're in the river now." He means the plant belongs to it. Overtop doesn't break the dam in a moment, it edits it. The first edits are cosmetic, chips, scrapes, foam where there used to be dust. Then the edits reach structure. The apron undermines at one edge, and the void grows upstream, stealing support from concrete that suddenly spans more than it should. Rebar groans. Somewhere unseen, a keyway takes load it wasn't supposed to. The lake doesn't surge so much as insist. A rescue siren, not the county one but the kind strapped to a volunteer's truck, finally cuts through the constant water. It dopplers past a row of lit windows. People stand in doorways holding pets, phones, keys, the wrong things. A man wades back to his car to get a backpack because it holds his mother's pills. He comes back with one arm high, the other lower, the pack dragging behind him like a net. Instruments push past familiar decimals. Uplift ticks up, pauses, then ticks again. The abutment joint that worked a hair now works a whisper. The word movement enters the room and refuses to leave. A geologist on headset asks for a read from a crack gauge nobody can reach without walking under concrete that's shedding water and luck. The answer is silence, then a new roar as another parapet block lets go. An operator whispers, "Not yet." He's talking to the dam, he's bargaining as if concrete listens. The chief answers out loud, "Hold." It's not an order, it's a hope shaped like one. The dam hasn't failed, yet, but the foundation is moving in ways that matter. Meanwhile, miles below, the river has already declared its own emergency. It's using neighborhoods as floodplain and infrastructure as driftwood. The line between control and collapse narrows to minutes, and the sound over the crest leaves no doubt about which way those minutes lean. Downstream, dominoes. Miles below the crest, the river stops behaving like scenery and starts behaving like a plan you didn't make. Levees built for century floods stare at a millennial load. Engineers knew the numbers in theory. Tonight they watch them move. The crown of a levee that always rode 8 inches above comfort loses those 8 inches in an hour and keeps sinking, not because dirt moves, but because water finds weight in places spreadsheets don't. Bridges aren't just crossings, they're strainers. Debris rafts, fence posts, dock sections, propane tanks, whole trees slew into pilings and stack until the river invents a dam in the wrong place. The flow narrows and speeds, kinks around the blockage, and shoots into a neighborhood that never thought it lived on a river. Driveways turn to channels. Garages turn to culverts. A minivan floats sideways and settles at a porch with its lights still blinking. Wastewater plants, the quiet lungs of a city, take it on the chin. Influent rises past design, past contingency, past denial. Motors drown, clarifiers turn brown. In a control room that smells like bleach and mud, a supervisor marks a line on a door frame with a Sharpie and says, "That's the cutoff." 10 minutes later, the line is underwater. Toxins and sewage mix with silt, a chemistry set nobody asked for. Downstream intakes on smaller systems spin shut to avoid sucking poison, which means taps will run dry to avoid running dirty. Substations arc in a blue-white that makes the rain look green. Insulators pop. A yard that fed 3 hospitals and a water plant goes dark, and the backup generators cough awake. Diesel isn't a fuel so much as a timer. The logistics guy who can refill those tanks is stuck behind a barricade guarded by a river wearing a road like a scarf. In hallways that were loud this morning, fluorescent lights go warm and then not. The ICU nurse checks the ventilator board and redraws her battery countdown with a pen that's starting to leak ink. Rail lines don't need to be underwater to fail. They only need to be unsupported. Ballast liquefies, ties float, and tracks twist in slow-motion snakes. A freight train takes a siding and parks with a hiss, carrying grain that won't make it to a feedlot and diesel that won't make it to a substation. A dispatcher traces alternate routes on a screen that looks like a subway map and discovers the obvious. The river is the only line that matters. A grain elevator on the valley edge becomes an island. Trucks queue on the last high berm, then turn around because the weighbridge is a foot deep. A fuel terminal pulls its hoses and closes the gate. Convenience stores burn through their last deliveries in a day, then tape, cash-only signs on doors as card readers blink dumbly. The economy doesn't stop. It stutters, trying to remember how to breathe without the grid. Microstory, inside a hospital that moved its generator up a floor after the last scare, the ICU nurse scrolls a list that no one ever wants to read. 2 ventilators left on mains, 5 on batteries, 1 battery that's never held a full charge. The med director, voice steady and eyes not, asks for the list of patients by wean potential. The nurse circles names. She hates the word potential tonight. She walks to a bed where a young father sleeps with plastic in his throat and a toddler's drawing taped to the monitor. She looks at the battery time like it's a tide chart. Neighborhoods far from the river learn how connected they are. A culvert fails under a road to a subdivision on a hill, not from floodwater in the street, but from pressure inside a pipe no one sees. A sinkhole opens under a fire engine that was trying to get to a transformer yard. The crew climbs out wet and angry and keeps walking with a toolbox that suddenly feels like a memory. Emergency managers run a playbook with pages stuck together. Shelters open in schools, gym floors lined with cots and blankets that smell of detergent and dust. A cafeteria ladies' union runs logistics like a battalion. Then a text pings, the school's sewer is backing up. Volunteers move cots to the library. The library's lower stacks hold biographies and now water. A volunteer writes "Shelter MOVED" on a poster board and tapes it to a door that soon floats. Across town, a prison hits its own flood line. Generators thrum. A warden has to choose between keeping a flooded kitchen going or moving inmates on buses nobody can spare. The buses arrive, later than anyone likes, and leave with red lights reflecting in water that wasn't supposed to be here. The route goes past a nursing home where the staff is counting pills and minutes. Insurance adjusters watch from laptops in dry zip codes, already parsing language about flood exclusions. A mayor with a wet tie holds a press conference on a staircase because the steps make a podium when desks are underwater. He promises help that hasn't been allocated yet and time that the river doesn't lend. A reporter asks whether the dam is safe. He answers with the only true thing left. We are doing everything we can, and it might not be enough. Back by the levee, a veteran crew chief checks a boil on the landward side, sand-laced water bubbling up where dry should be. He builds a ring with sandbags and watches the color change. The boil calms, then returns 2 feet away. He keeps building circles inside circles because that's the job when the big wall upstream is writing your shift notes in spray. Hospitals stretch diesel with rolling blackouts inside their own walls, floor by floor, wing by wing. A dialysis center calls for a generator that's already promised to a communications tower. The tower loses power anyway. A firefighter uses a chainsaw to carve a hole in a wooden fence to float a neighbor's dog into a kayak. These are not plans, they're edits. Freight, fuel, food, water, power, care each tries to stay upright on its own legs, but each leg leans on another. As the river takes one, the rest tilt. Markets will put numbers on this later, call it a shock, a hit, a reprice. Tonight, it's simpler. The valley is learning how many dominoes were lined up and how fast they fall when the first nudge starts a run. Upstream, the roar changes pitch, a sound like a mountain cracking. The crews on the levee look up without meaning to. The river glances off their berm as if to say, "Keep up." They do, because that's what you do until someone calls you off, or the river does it for you. Failure line. It starts as a line you can't see, only infer from instruments and sound. In the gallery, a gauge that's been steady for hours walks a few thousandths. The tech calls it in flat, but his pencil digs harder into the paper. Up on the crest, the overtop sheet fattens, pulling at parapet scars until edges collapse like wet cardboard. The dam is still one piece. Inside, it feels like it's learning a new language. Cracks don't appear like lightning bolts. They propagate, choosing paths of least strength along lift joints that were supposed to behave like memory. Sheer keys between pores take the first insults, resisting like teeth. A keyway starts to carry more than it was meant to. The first microslip is a hush nobody hears, then a jolt someone swears was thunder. The line isn't straight. It zigzags through places where grout was perfect and others where it only thought it was. The foundation key that ties concrete to canyon rock was always the quiet hero. Tonight, uplift sneaks fingers beneath it, prying in increments. Drainage wells bleed, but head wins by persisting. Along one abutment, interlock between blocks acts like it always has, strong, until a patch of rock weathered by ancient water decides it's tired of pretending to be steel. Interlock turns to handshake. A block feels it first, and rotation begins as a suggestion. Rotation shows up as inches on instruments that were built to notice millimeters. A crest survey rod drops a hair, then a little more. The operator who's been staring at decimals feels the shift in his feet. He keys the radio and says, "We've got differential." Nobody asks where. Everyone knows where matters less than what it means. The block that rotates pulls on its neighbors, asking for help they can't afford to give. The reservoir answers with a nudge disguised as a wave, seiche. Wind and spill pulses set the surface rocking inside the canyon bowl. It's not dramatic until the timing syncs with the new weakness. A swell slaps the crest from behind. At the same instant, water claws the downstream face. Loads that should resolve into rock wander. The arch thrust looks for purchase in the abutments and finds, for the first time tonight, hesitation. Inside the gallery's air gets colder. It always does when water finds new places to breathe. A hairline in a wall darkens, then dries, then darkens again. A weep that was clear turns the faintest T. A geologist, listening on headset from a room plastered with maps, asks for a hammer tap read, old school. The tech taps the concrete and hears a tone he doesn't like. Less bell, more thud. He doesn't need a spectrogram to know hollows are growing where solids were. Up top, the emergency spillway chews at its margin, stealing attention. It's doing the dirty work it was asked to do, taking flow the main chute can't. But each gallon sent that way is a gamble against a hillside that wants to be earth again. The main dam takes the rest, Overtop still dragging at its face. The balance keeps the lake barely shy of a number that would have made the crest disappear entirely. Barely is enough, until rotation inches forward. A shear initiates along a lift joint that was always the border between two good pours. You don't see it. You feel it in the way the roar changes, richer, with a note in the low end, like the river added an organ. The block settles, not collapsing, but finding a new seat where none was designed. The crest drops inches, becomes feet measured in quarters. Somewhere, a parapet stump tilts and vanishes into white. The arch thrust searches for rock and finds air metaphor first, then physics. In a perfect world, force travels from water to concrete to abutment to mountain. In this one, the path kinks around the rotated block. Loads concentrate where designers never planned. A tendon of stress snaps in the body, a sound like a gunshot swallowed by thunder. Men in the gallery freeze, then move because freezing is a luxury. Lake surface heaves on a bigger seiche, the storm's wind aligning with the canyon's length. The swell runs to the weak zone and hammers it. The drop on the crest grows. The block that wanted to rotate decides. It pivots a fraction more, dragging rebar like harp strings until they yield with skirls that no one will forget. The dam's geometry, its virtue, warps enough to betray itself. For a moment, it holds in this ugly shape. The drainage system hisses and coughs. Relief wells spit steady. You could be fooled into thinking it's another pause. Then the downstream toe, already undermined by days of hard water and hours of overtop, loses a bite. The foundation key, pried and tired, gives up a strip. The load that used to find granite finds nothing. When load meets air, structures stop negotiating. The wall doesn't explode. It releases like a clasp undone. The failing block drops. The adjacent sections follow the path of least excuse, and the reservoir, held at bay for generations, introduces itself to the valley as if remembering an old route. For a breath, the gap is narrow and violent. A jet needles into night, tearing itself wider with every cubic foot. Upstream, the lake tilts toward the wound. Downstream, the roar becomes geography. Air turns to spray, spray to water, water to momentum. The valley stops being a map of streets and parcels and becomes a channel, shallow at first, then deep as the gap in the wall teaches the river how to run again. Now it's not water escaping a machine. It's a river reclaiming itself, indifferent to the blueprints that tried to teach it manners. The first hour after. The first minutes don't look like a movie. They look like clocks arguing. A rupture time gets logged at the dam. Down in the valley, street cameras catch a shimmer crossing an intersection that used to be a line on a flood map. Between those 2 points, a wave is learning how to run. Arrival times become the only language anyone trusts. Hydrologists feed models with a gap width that's widening by the minute. They print a table no one will finish reading: 10 minutes to the first bend, 27 to the rail trestle, 43 to the riverfront district, an hour and change to the last town before the desert opens up. The numbers have ranges. The river hates ranges. It picks the earlier one. The wave isn't a single wall. It's a leading surge, fast and shoulder-high, packed with wood and tin and air, followed by a darker mass that turns corners with patience. In the first low town, it slips under parked cars, lifts them, and pieces out which ones float. A man steps off his porch into knee water that becomes wastewater before his second step. He turns back for a photo album, then doesn't. Industrial sites see it next. A tank farm on the flats has berms for the once in a century. The berms hold for 4 minutes, then a corner slumps. Diesel skates away in ribbons on brown water. Across the road, a pesticide warehouse sits high, but its loading dock doesn't. Pallets bump the door until the door gives. Labels designed for regulatory calm peel in the wrong direction. Firefighters know the list of chemicals by heart. Tonight, the list knows them. At the wastewater plant already drowning, a valve designed to isolate the headwork sticks half shut. Operators wade to it with pry bars and curses, torque it open, and watch a new problem reveal itself. The outfall is now upstream. While they fight physics, a surface water intake downstream shutters to avoid pulling a cocktail into a city. Taps will go dry on purpose to keep worse from happening. In kitchens, people turn knobs and listen to the hollow hiss of nothing. A smaller dam downstream, an old irrigation structure with a reputation, takes the first surge square. It wasn't meant for this. Operators dump gates and pray for symmetry. The river laughs and pours around the structure's shoulders. The old concrete holds, barely, and sends a rebound that complicates arrival times for the next town. Hydraulics make jokes at midnight. Emergency drawdowns at other reservoirs begin whether the paperwork exists or not. A flood manager keys a radio and says, "Open to full safe," then adds, "Define safe." No one does. A cascade risk hangs over the valley like a rumor that got promoted. Nothing else upstream fails, but for an hour the word cascading sits inside every sentence. Microstory, a school gym, the kind with banners from seasons when teams had time to care, has been a shelter for 3 hours. Cots are numbered in tape. A volunteer keeps a list on a clipboard she holds like a life preserver. When the flood maps on a phone redraw with a new shade of blue, someone realizes the gym's a bowl. Water noses under the side door like a cat, then marches 4 inches at a time. "We move," the principal says, voice automatic, like a fire drill that matters. Cars won't reach the high school. People walk with blankets over heads that didn't plan for rain. Relief arrives from the air, late and complicated. Helicopters that couldn't fly in the teeth of the storm now lift, but they're triaging a geography with fewer places to land than anyone remembered. A Chinook drops sandbags onto a levee that's pretending to be a cliff. A smaller ship winches 3 people from a roof strung with Christmas lights that never came down. The air show is brave and insufficient. The ridge road washed out hours earlier. The crews see it from above like a sentence already written. Traffic turns to sculpture in every escape corridor the wave touches. An overpass fills a lane with water that hides its depth. Someone tries it, engines flood. The jam behind them is now part of the river's schedule. A state trooper climbs onto a hood, waves people backward, and watches water cover the placard that names the bridge. Insurance adjusters are still dry and already sharpening definitions. Flood will be a word that ends arguments, not begins them. Federal disaster math opens in rooms where the carpet's dry. The first estimates slide around because the floor is moving. A city manager says, "We'll need help." A federal voice says, "We're on it," and means it, and also knows that waiting rooms matter here too. Who pays first? People with time and sweat and what they thought was theirs. Who never? The ones whose losses don't fit a form. A trailer with cash under a mattress and title papers in a drawer now somewhere in a cottonwood. A landscaper's truck that was both office and savings, now a note, now a story. On the dam, the gap widens. The discharge peak roars. Down the valley, sirens give way to generators, then to nothing where the batteries quit. A nurse checks her ventilator list and makes the call she was born to avoid. She moves a breathing tube from one mouth to another and holds a stranger's hand so they don't feel alone inside a decision that should never belong to a nurse. By the end of the first hour, the map is redrawn by water and choice. The wave hasn't finished, but the valley has learned the shape of its near future. The morning will bring numbers, and with them, a different kind of weather, politics, promises, and a long math that starts with what was lost and asks what must change. The $500 billion bill. Morning doesn't bring calm, it brings calculators. The wave is still moving, but the ledger has already started. Direct losses land first, houses with lines of mud at the ceiling, factories with motors soaked in silt, orchards whose roots can't breathe, highways peeled like tape, transmission towers bent into the shape of questions. Crews drive corridors that used to be streets and tag structures red, yellow, green. Red piles up. Yellow means months. Green often means for now. Power lines lie in arcs across fields that were harvests yesterday. Poles tilt, insulators hang, and substation yards wear a crust of brown that will turn every bolt into a resistor. Grid operators sketch out a skeleton network to get hospitals back, then water plants, then neighborhoods. Each mile of line becomes a line item. The first number on the whiteboard looks like a phone number. It's for one county. On the farms, pumps that drank 30 feet down cough mud. Drip systems that fed vines for decades are now nets for debris. A grower walks a field and bends a leaf that should be green but is now a question. He calls his banker, who calls the insurer, who points to language written in calm years, flood, exclusion. The disaster fund will help, but help is a bridge, not a rebuild. Factories along the riverfront, paint, lumber, food processing, become chemistry problems. Cleanup isn't a broom, it's a permit. Hazardous waste contractors build schedules on clipboards and bill by the hour. Jobs that were supposed to clock back in by Monday slide to whenever the air doesn't hurt to breathe. A forklift sits with a high water mark across its windshield like an accusation. Highways fracture in ways the map app can't reroute around. A span over tributary needs a new deck and maybe new piers. A rail trestle is twisted into modern art. The agency that writes checks for concrete never wrote one this big for this long of a corridor. Detours add hours. Hours add costs that don't look like disaster relief, but live there anyway. Then the water war begins, quietly at first, then not. When a reservoir fails, the legal scaffolding that allocates every drop goes smoky. Rights that were senior become academic if the pipe is dry. Cities file emergency petitions. Irrigation districts call emergency boards. Groundwater becomes the backstop. Wells spin up, and the water table drops like a floor giving way. Subsidence, the slow theft of elevation, accelerates under orchards that can't afford a gap year. Urban water supply plans were built like tables with 4 legs: river intake, reservoir storage, some groundwater, a little recycled. Kick out the reservoir and the table leans hard. Desal pitches show up in inboxes from companies with glossy brochures and big promises. Coastal cities nod. Inland ones eye price tags that start at billions and grow. Meanwhile, neighborhoods learn how fast boil order turns into distribution site, and how many languages a sign must carry to be useful. Power markets spasm when a big hydro block disappears. Contracts unwind. Spot prices spike at dinner time. Gas peaker plants roar to life and burn money and fuel, while grid planners nod grimly and say it's what they're there for. Emissions jump. So do complaints. The bill includes both the kilowatt hours you buy and the ones you don't, because the grid is trying not to fall over. Rebuild politics writes its own drama. Some neighborhoods are easy to repair on paper and impossible to insure on purpose. Do you buy people out and give the river room, or stack rock and asphalt and dare the next storm? Property lines that felt like promises meet maps that are now wrong. Public meetings fill with grief dressed as fury. A planner points to a blue swath labeled floodway and says retreat. A grandfather points to a photograph and says home. Markets don't wait for committees. Insurance companies harden their stance the way levees tried to harden their banks. Premiums climb. Deductibles become gates. Some carriers simply leave. Municipal bonds for river cities pay a little more to lure buyers with stronger stomachs. Ratings agencies find their weather pages. The cost of borrowing becomes part of the floodplain. Meanwhile, supply chains find out how many of their nodes sat on the quiet side of a river. Grain waits on a spur that won't be repaired before winter. A battery plant upstream needs a mineral process downstream. The trucks that carried it took a road that's now a channel. Warehouses flood a foot and lose everything below the second shelf because microbes don't care about discounts. Online orders blink delayed and then cancelled. It feels small until there are thousands of smalls. The lawsuits line up like driftwood at a bridge. Was the risk known? Did the agency ignore guidance? Were the warnings timely? A retired engineer opens a garage file for a plaintiff's lawyer and says, "Start here." Governments brace behind immunity. Some of it holds, some cracks, all of it drains time. Settlements arrive years later, too late to keep a hardware store open, but right on time for a bond payment. Now tally the intangible ledger. A region rewrites school calendars because buses drive detours through towns that weren't on their routes. A hospital hires security for its diesel tanks. A water utility stocks bilingual door hangers that say plainly, "Don't drink this." An evacuation route becomes a park on a map so that next time the road doubles as a levee. 1,000 small changes, each with a cost, each a tax paid to memory. Here's the number nobody wants to say out loud in one breath: 500 billion. Not to gold plate a new wall, but to settle claims, rebuild grids and roads, refit water systems, buy out parcels, raise others, write resilient code into concrete, and absorb the interest on waiting. It isn't a fix. It's the bill for pretending time wasn't changing the math. The valley will pay it in dollars. The people will pay it in years. The paper trail. The river wrote last night in water. The morning opens a different archive, files, audits, memos that say what everyone knew and no one moved. In a state office with carpet that survived several administrations, a binder labeled Deferred Maintenance sits fat with tabs. The first page lists inspections marked satisfactory, then annotated later with asterisks: visual only, access limited, follow-up recommended. The follow-ups stack in a column that became tomorrow's chore, until tomorrow ended up underwater. Audits flagged the pattern years back. A consultant wrote that Spillway concrete showed surface distress consistent with cavitation history and recommended aeration retrofits prior to operation at elevated discharges. It read careful, not dramatic. The price tag was real. The fix slid into a category that made budgets wince: preventative, not urgent. Urgent was always somewhere else. Inspection reports tripped on their own language. "No significant change observed" is a phrase that loves quiet summers. A diver who logged a spall near a gate recess added photos that looked like every concrete photo, gray on gray. The caption carried the weight: edge chipping likely to propagate under high-velocity flow. The note landed in a system that tracked it, assigned it a number, and then watched that number age. A year later, a structural review did the math on probable maximum flood, with a climate appendix stapled on. The appendix asked a fair question: are the tails fatter? It recommended updating PMP guidance with new storm ensembles. That update entered a queue behind maps, behind levee certifications, behind everything that came with ribbon cuttings. The hydrologist who wrote it retired without seeing the table turn. The memos about foundation uplift read like the voice of a careful cousin. Drainage galleries functioning within historical range, with rising trends during high reservoir conditions. Monitor. A piezometer string showed a seasonal bump. Someone underlined seasonal. A footnote mentioned a stuck relief valve last spring that took an extra hour to free. It was fixed. It was also a data point that wanted company. Then the emails, the ones you only find after. A project engineer sent a note titled Spillway Aeration Scope Reduction Implications. He laid out options: full slot retrofit now, partial deflector now with full later, or defer with inspection increase. The cost curves sloped steeply. He highlighted a line: risk increases non-linearly above XCFS due to surface roughness feedback. The reply from a manager didn't dispute the physics. It asked whether phased implementation could align with anticipated budget realities. Elsewhere, a procurement team circulated a scope for temporary gate refurbishment, 1 unit. Why 1? Because the window at Low Lake was short, the shop space was limited, and the funding line couldn't stretch. The plan banked on the rest performing within spec. Performance within spec has a way of assuming the world will stay inside its lines. Climate guidance delayed itself. Draft chapters lived in folders with dates that slipped. A meeting summary captured the conflict: update the hydrology and we rewrite design floods, and we trigger retrofits nobody priced. The room punted, accept current risk posture with commitment to revisit next cycle. Next cycle came with fire seasons and smoke and drought declarations. The revisit stayed on a slide. A whistleblower email doesn't look like a siren. It looks like a person hedging politeness with urgency. I'm concerned our current hazard classification doesn't fully reflect compound risk if spillway capacity is reduced during high inflow. He attached photos, trends, a rough Andretti cavitation index calculation. He got a meeting that ended with parking lot promises. He also got an HR note reminding him to follow communications channels. A retired engineer, grey ponytail, hands that remember rebar, kept a file in his garage. 30 years of warnings is a lot of paper. He saved the memos where he wrote, "We are borrowing from luck." He saved the meeting minutes where someone said, "If it hasn't failed yet, maybe the factor of safety is conservative," and someone else laughed. He saved the aerial photo from a drought year showing a hairline at a transition slab. With a grease pencil arrow he drew himself. When the water came this time, he pulled the file and called a reporter he didn't like, but trusted to read. Risk acceptable is a phrase that appears again and again. It's not sinister, it's how agencies survive. Acceptable compared to what? To budgets, to other dams, to roads that kill more people than water ever has in that county. The phrase does a lot of work. It turns red into amber and amber into later. It's also the line that will sit in depositions like a patient stone. Audits show another thing, inspections downgraded quietly. A dam once rated good slides to fair with a comment that nothing changed but the rating scale. A spillway condition shifts from serviceable to serviceable with caveats. Caveats multiply. They never make ribbon cuttings. They do make nights like this. The system didn't fail by accident. It worked as chosen. Choices were made to defer work that didn't shake the calendar, to keep rates stable, to manage optics, to live inside a hydrology that was already moving underfoot. Each choice made sense up close. Together, they set the table. When the river arrived, it ate everything that wasn't bolted down, and then some of what was. Prevention costs billions, and we told ourselves we'd find them later. Later showed up with a siren. If the price of avoiding last night was high, the cost of resilience after is higher still. The question isn't whether we can afford it. It's whether we can stand another paper trail that reads like a prequel to a disaster everyone swears nobody saw coming. The fix that isn't. Morning after plans arrive glossy and confident. Harden the giant, pour thicker armor, taller parapets, smarter gates. Big dam fixes feel satisfying, steel you can point at. But compound extremes don't negotiate with single points of pride. Distributed storage whispers a different answer. Canals with adjustable weirs, fields that accept winter water, aquifer recharge basins that bank surplus like savings. Upstream, beaver analog dams slow pulses without press releases. None is heroic alone. Together they shave peaks the wall can't. Smart spillways help, air slots, aerators, fusigates that fail on purpose. They buy time, not certainty. Forecast-informed operations could have dumped before the storm, but lawyers write river clocks. Pre-release authority dies in courtrooms that fear dry taps more than wet streets. Managed retreat is the honest fix. Give floodplains back to rivers, buyouts with dignity, zoning that remembers water draws its own maps. Politics hates that sentence until drills prove the human layer works. Sirens that scream in 5 languages, buses staged, towns that practice losing power and don't lose people. The river will be a partner or a plaintiff. The meaning of a walls. We built walls because rivers taught us fear before they taught us grace. Whole towns remembered flood years by smell, the musk of wet hay, the sour of basements, the silence after. A wall promised a different memory, switches, schedules, a lake you could point to and say, ours. Concrete turned danger into digits on a dashboard. That comfort worked, until last night reminded everyone what the dashboard leaves out. There's a reason those walls grew into monuments. They weren't just engineering. They were a story about mastery. Spin a turbine and lights come on, close a gate and a city sleeps. Farm a dry valley like a green ledger. Wealth followed, then habit, then a kind of amnesia. The wall stood long enough that people forgot it was a bet. The reservoir's blue looked permanent on maps. Permanence is persuasive ink. Get this, the controls made us brave in ways we didn't notice. Developers sold homes with river views, counting on a promise in rebar. Farmers planted permanent crops where floods used to borrow land. City councils zoned industrial parks on flats with old silt in the soil. Every decision stacked weight on a single line of concrete. That line carried more than water. It carried our confidence. But switches have their own lie. They suggest that nature is a device. Twist the right knob and you get a predictable output. The lie holds for seasons. It breaks in nights like the one we just walked through, when snowmelt and rain align, when upstream scars cough timber, when the grid wants stability and the spillway wants mercy, when the law wants certainty and the river wants room. The human cost hides in those expectations. Downstream, a nurse weighed battery minutes because a region believed a wall would always keep the river in its lane. A sheriff drew evacuation lines on a whiteboard because the map treated blue as polite. An engineer wrote high confidence in a memo because the model behaved, not the weather. Nobody set out to gamble with lives. We did it by agreeing, quietly, to be reassured. So what's the meaning of a wall after it fails? It's not that walls are pointless. They've saved more lives than they've taken. It's that a wall is only honest when it's one piece in a bigger humility, redundancy, slack, ways for water to leave without making headlines. A single monument can't carry a century of growth, drought, fire, and a climate that now throws compound punches. We need systems that assume surprise, not just structures that assume control. Humility looks boring on paper. It's diversions that open before the forecast is certain. It's wetlands that look like empty fields until they suddenly hold a city's luck. It's groundwater basins we refill in fat years so thin years don't drive panic. It's sirens that actually run in languages that match who lives there. It's drills that inconvenience a Saturday so a Tuesday night is survivable. None of that earns a ribbon. All of it saves funerals. There's another layer, responsibility. People upstream profit from the order a wall imposes: cheap power, stable supply, water on demand. People downstream pay when the order slips. Equity isn't a speech, it's budget lines that move money before disaster moves lines on a map. If a dam underwrites a booming metro, then buyouts in a floodplain shouldn't be charity, they should be part of the cost of doing business. If a farm relies on stored river, then the fund that maintains spillways shouldn't be optional, ever. Memory matters too. Regions forget floods because success replaces stories. Museums hold turbines and hero photos from dedication day. Less space is given to mudlines on kitchen walls. We need to keep both, not to scare, but to remember that safety is a practice, not a state. Put the old high water marks back on the courthouse steps. Teach third graders what evacuation route means and why it changes. Normalize the boring habits that make drama less likely. S where the math points forward. Monument thinking says, raise the dam, armor the chute, bigger, higher, stronger. System thinking says, make 10 smaller bets that fail gently instead of one big one that fails loud. Spread storage. Loosen legal knots so pre-release isn't a political dare. Fund maintenance like the lights depend on it, because they do. Bind water rights to real hydrology, not yesterday's averages. Make the default setting, leave room, and require arguments to take it back. And yes, admit that some places won't be rebuilt the way they were. Retreat is a word that politics hates and rivers understand. Giving space back isn't surrender, it's strategy. Towns that practiced evacuation, staged buses, and bothered to keep sirens alive lost no one last night. That's proof the human fix works. If we're brave enough to move lines on our maps, the river will meet us more than halfway. The meaning of a wall, then, is neither hero nor villain. It's a tool, powerful and limited. Our mistake wasn't building it. It was believing it would always be enough alone. Resilience will look less like a single skyline and more like a web, messy, redundant, forgiving. The river hasn't changed character. We changed the odds and forgot the house still wins sometimes. The work now is simple, not easy. Replace bravado with memory, monuments with margins, control with choreography. And start before the next siren has to teach us the same lesson. Because this story isn't unique. Every modern system hides choke points with the same math weighting, grids stretched thin, pipelines that assume peace, ports that forget storms have grown teeth. The river just showed us the syllabus. The test covers more than water. We tried to buy certainty and ended up leasing risk, with interest always due. If this hit close to home, subscribe and keep going. Watch our next film on the choke points that bind the modern world and what happens when one slips. New episodes weekly.